Hello and welcome everybody in the room and also everybody who may be watching live on YouTube right now. And welcome to sort of like the Friday lunch forum talk, which is a kind of traditional installation that we've had as part of the Center for American Architecture and Design's kind of task to really kind of provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, scholarship, and kind of debate here at the School of Architecture. My name is Martin Hettasch. I am on the faculty advisory board of the Center for American Architecture and Design. Maybe just a couple of words generally, really what we do at CAAD. So as I said, like we sort of understand ourselves to be a kind of platform for the exchange of ideas, the dissemination of knowledge and scholarship within the School of Architecture, so faculty or other people affiliated with the school, but also beyond the School of Architecture, and certainly kind of encompassing all the disciplines that we have here at the school. We roughly have, like, it's not every week that we hold the forum. I would say we have about between 5 and 8 per semester usually. And correct me if I'm wrong. That's sort of my count. And it's a presentation that is going to be hopefully also a little bit informal, a way that will leave some time. We should have some time for questions and discussions. So I'll act as the moderator like after the presentation. And so hopefully we'll have some participation on that as well. Today we're happy to welcome faculty, Juana Salcedo, who is an architectural designer and scholar who works at the intersection of architecture and urbanism, which is very close to my own heart. And her work critically reflects on meanings, uses, and shapes of public space and the diverse ways in which the spatial arts contribute to the making and caring, to the making of convivial, caring, and just alternatives. She is a designer and has been a designer in various contexts, including at the El Equipo Mazzanti and Geografia Urbana, and also is an independent designer and consultant, and has throughout her career led projects at a variety of scales, from small residential projects to community center and urban scale projects and research. She draws on concepts from environmental history, urban political ecology and decolonial studies, as well as science and technology to reconnect architecture and cities with larger environmental and socioeconomic processes that shape them. She focuses on studies in Latin America, and I think this is also kind of part of what the title and the kind of content of her presentation is about today. And she's also interested in exploring visualizations and tools such as mapping as key means to foreground spatial issues and territorial discussions at a scale, which I think is kind of an interesting scale that I think a lot of people have also problems sort of grasping if they're not also presented and kind of disseminated in the right way. So I'm going to leave it at that brief introduction, and I'm going to sort of hand it over to Juana. And again, welcome to the Friday Lunch Forum.
So, thank you, Martin, for the introduction, and thanks all for coming. Thank you to the Center for American Architecture and Design for this invitation. I'm very happy to present this research, which is still in the process of development. It will be very helpful to hear your thoughts, and also because I'm teaching a seminar on the subject next spring. So, this research has been developed with the support initially of a research and development grant from the Graham Foundation in 2020, but it was also enriched by a fellowship that is for the summer school in global studies and critical theory on planetary urbanscapes. That is a program organized by Duke University, the University of Virginia, and the Università di Bologna in 2019. In addition, it has also been enriched by the discussions with around 36 architecture students that took the seminar in 2020 back in Bogota in La Universidad de los Andes, and also by conversations with many colleagues, friends, and particularly the feminist reading group Las Lámparas. So I'll start going straight to the topic of my project that is called A Cartography of Interconnection, Jaguars, Humans, and Urbanscapes in the Americas. So the Jaguar Corridor Initiative proposes the creation of a continuous territory that bridges jaguar populations from northern Argentina to northern Mexico over an area that is 1/3 the size of the US. For the researchers involved in this initiative, the project exceeds the conservation of the feline. As a top predator that needs large expanses of land to live, scientists consider the jaguar an umbrella species. They regard its presence in a territory as a thermometer to measure the health of an ecosystem, indicating animal and vegetation diversity, as well as water and air quality. Led by the organization Panthera, the corridor is a response to the declining population of jaguars and to the cascading consequences that such decline will have on entire ecosystems. In 2018, the initiative gained the official support of 14 jaguar range countries and leading conservation organizations, and launched the Jaguar 2030, a roadmap to implement the project in 30 priority landscapes. In doing so, the Jaguar Corridor has emerged as a novel initiative of hemispheric integration to attend biodiversity loss, one in which ecosystems rather than national boundaries prevail. And this is just a small way to compare the amount of land that just one jaguar requires, one jaguar plus 2 female and cubs in comparison to the extent of cities and in relation to its population. But the jaguar is deeply intertwined with urban, agricultural, and extractive landscapes and infrastructures. Not only the corridor is defined in opposition to variables linked to urbanization. Given the large territory that jaguars require for their survival, researchers underscore the success of the corridor depends as much on the existence of favorable conditions within human-dominated landscapes as on the preservation of protected areas. So this cartography of interconnection is a way to make visible the entanglements and frictions between the processes of urbanization and the Jaguar Corridor. So far, the initiative has been largely under the radar of urban and landscape architecture researchers. Perhaps the exception is the Atlas for the End of the World, where Richard Weller includes the corridor as part of 38 large-scale projects seeking to restore and reconnect fragmented ecosystems across the world. In the Atlas, Weller underscores that conservation is an issue that cuts from the cores of our densest cities to the furthest wilds. This affirmation encapsulates a call by many in the urban studies and landscape architecture studies to recognize the urban fabric beyond the traditional limits of the city, and to examine the ways in which extensive and distant territories have been increasingly transformed and incorporated in the processes of urbanization. The cartography that follows can be seen as a tool to decenter the city as the privileged area of urban inquiry in Latin America. So in the past decades, Panthera and its conservation allies have worked towards sharing the project with wider audiences by tackling on what Ursula K. Heiss refers as the broader structures of imagination. These structures make conservation, she says, primarily a cultural issue, questions of what we value and what stories we tell, and only secondarily, issues of science. So we have documentaries, exhibitions, public events, and storytelling in social networks that foreground the feline as an icon of the Americas, the king jaguar, a mysterious and elusive animal that safeguards the region's last remnants of tropical forest and wildlife at risk of extinction by expansive human encroachment. In these circulating images, such as the ones that I'm showing, the feline is presented both as a spiritual and cultural icon that indigenous communities have revered for thousands of years, and as an icon of sustainability and international cooperation in responding to climate change. This effective mechanism is necessary to attain public engagement with the project. At the same time, if a sole focus, this view can also obscure the corridor's intertwinement with urban life, perpetuating the environment, society, and culture-nature dichotomies. So the map of the Jaguar Corridor is probably the most widely used image to present the initiative. It synthesizes decades of collaborative research from scientists across the region to trace the viable habitat of the feline, and has become an effective device to encourage broader audiences to imagine a continuous territory across the hemisphere, a common project. Recognizing mapping as an active agent of intervention, the Cartography of Interconnection provides relevant information that moves us from a general view of the Jaguar Corridor to a situated understanding of the initiative and its entanglement with urban life. It does so by correlating the initiative with public data about the anthropogenic transformations and socio-environmental struggles that are symptomatic of urbanization processes. So in the first part of the talk, I'd like to discuss the results of this exercise as a point of departure to further navigate the corridor. What I would like to do is to consider this cartography, or that this cartography becomes eventually an open digital tool for spatial researchers. Then, rather than an exclusive issue of wildlife conservation in the final part of the talk, I argue we can reinterpret this territorial aspiration as an infrastructure of care for the sustenance of both human and more than human life, and therefore as a deeply political endeavor. I will delve on this proposition further. For now, I just want to say that I understand infrastructure not as a specific artifact or physical arrangement exclusive to capitalism, but rather, as anthropologist Ashley Kars has expressed, as an ongoing process of relationship building that requires both repair and maintenance, one that is both social and ecological. So when I propose to reinterpret the Jaguar Corridor as an infrastructure, I aim to recognize how this conservation project is embedded in relations of power that define how the corridor is shaped and taken care of, and whose lives are enhanced and whose are diminished by this process. The Jaguar Corridor Initiative is a distinct aspiration from the history of integration projects that have sought to reshape Latin America since the 19th century up to this day. And this is a branch of the research that I'm not going to cover, but I also track the history of these different aspirations. In these aspirations, territorial integration has been persistently equated with frontier expansion through tropes of progress, growth, and development. The latest iteration is the Initiative for the Regional Integration of the South American Infrastructure, which is this map. The IRSA was inaugurated in 2000, the same year that the Jaguar Corridor was launched, and it happened in a context where there was an increased demand for mineral resources and agro-industrial products from Asia. IRSA enthusiastically promised to overcome the geographical obstacles that had prevented opening the continent's interior to the global markets through a heavy investment in transport, energy, and communication infrastructures. IRSA and the past repertoire of iterations that have planned the construction of railroads, highways, waterways, dams, ports, and model cities, among other infrastructures, have privileged a view of an external nature that needs to be mastered to ensure the smooth extraction and flow of resources, goods, and peoples for capitalist development. The final quest of these enterprises has been the world's largest tropical forest, the Amazon, a region long seen both as a promising resource frontier to be linked to the global markets and as a counterpoint of modernity in need of outside intervention. In contrast to exclusive commitments to progress and development, reinterpreting the Jaguar Corridor as an infrastructure of care can provide an alternative that attends to the very environmental consequences brought by the previous processes of territorial integration and frontier conquest. So as a species that reveals information about the larger conditions that allow both human and more than human lives to flourish or to decline, understanding the Jaguar Corridor as an infrastructure of care might offer an opportunity to envisage a common project of multi-species justice, one where partial recuperation is still possible. So in this first part, I want to start by talking about how is this Jaguar Corridor defined. So the Jaguar Corridor reflects a paradigm shift that has shaped both conservation science, but also urban studies in the past decades. I will succinctly describe this shift as the recognition that the binaries nature, city, urban, rural are no longer useful categories to describe, analyze, and transform our environment if they ever were at all. In 1999, genetic studies on jaguars' DNA found that instead of 8 subspecies, as scientists had believed for over 30 years, 40 years, the feline was actually one taxon, genetically connected throughout the Americas. This finding shifted conservation efforts away from mainstream approaches that worked at the national level and focused on securing protected areas. Preserving the life of the jaguar across the hemisphere has become a matter of making sure corridors exist, often across human-dominated landscapes, to link jaguar populations. So the definition of the corridor was an immense collaborative effort of over 130 scientists who identified the location of jaguar populations. They evaluated aspects such as habitat quality, possible human conflicts, the approximate number of jaguars that lived in them, and the availability of prey. Through this survey, researchers were able to have a first diagnosis of the main risk and critical areas that need to be protected. And these are the areas that are called the Jaguar Conservation Units. That was the first step. The second step involved identifying the feasible movement paths of the jaguar through a GIS analysis that considered elevation, as the jaguar mainly lives up to 2,000 meters above sea level, and other variables linked to symptoms of urbanization, land cover type, percentage of tree and shrub cover, distance to roads, as well as distance to human settlements and areas of high population density. GIS results are constantly validated and readjusted on the ground with both jaguar experts and local inhabitants. So the conclusions basically reached that what they expected that there was still possibility for connection. And here we can see the main areas: the Amazon, the ones with more vulnerability up north in the frontier, Mexico, US, and southern Argentina and Brazil, and this bottleneck that is Colombia and Panama that cuts South America to Central America. So precisely because the territorial presence of the jaguar is proportionally inverse to urban life, the Jaguar Corridor provides us with a radiography of urbanization, one that challenges a city-centric view of the urban experience. The making of a cartography of interconnection then departs from an understanding of cities as mere dots in a territory. The field of urban studies has challenged this misconception, defining urbanization as a socio-ecological process of capitalism that has extended its reach well beyond cities, over increasingly larger and geographically dispersed territories in an uneven and in a planetary scale. Urban political ecologists Maria Kaika and Eric Singwedo encapsulate well this paradigm shift when describing urbanization as the history of urbanizing nature, a process, they argue, incorporates, transforms, and commodifies all types of nature to support urban life. The Jaguar Corridor is both a stronghold of these extended processes of urbanization and a contested territory in friction with these socio-ecological flows. So the declining population of jaguars is related to how this feline has been a commodity in the last centuries. The jaguar has a long history of being commodified. Jaguar trophy hunting was a small-scale trend during the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Yet it was the fashion craze for spotted cat skins during the 1960s what turned the feline into a highly valuable commodity. Sparked by the metropolitan desires of wealthy industrialized countries, mainly European countries, United States, and Japan, this boom led to the massive killing of around 180,000 jaguars just in the Brazilian Amazon in the span of 2 decades and had a severe impact on jaguar populations. Because of that, many Latin American governments eventually forbid jaguar trade in the territories and signed the 1975 Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, that I will call CITES, and banned the commercial trade of the feline. So protection meant a stricter regulation, but not a complete end to trading. In this map that I made with the information collected in the CITES open database between 1975 and 2019, I show how the complex web of jaguar trade covers all continents. It does so, however, in an uneven way. The US accounts for 1/3 of the accumulated imports. The jaguar is commodified as a live animal, as skins and garments, as jaguar parts, including bones, teeth, claws, skulls, among others. Its trade is usually notified either for zoos, commercial, circus, personal, scientific, or educational uses. Although during the first 20 years, almost 1/4 of the transactions actually did not specify the purpose. And this is like a period map showing the change of the trade. So if during the first 20 years, it was more about skins and live animals, since 1998, it has changed and it's mainly live animals, and more recently, it has become a matter of parts. So it is hard to account for the shift in geography of jaguar consumption that has occurred in the past decades. Several reports suggest that the Americas has become the next frontier for illegal traders in response to the demand of Asian consumers for jaguar fangs and other parts used in traditional medicine after the depletion of the Asian tigers. And this is due because Chinese enterprises have started to come with strength in Chinese investment to South America. Yet others have linked the trade to ayahuasca and shamanic tourist boom, as well as to the domestic market and the traditional uses of jaguar parts within the region. Just last year, CITES published an investigation arguing that there was not accurate data to trace that complex web of illegal trading, but that there was no evidence that the geography of the jaguar trade has actually shifted towards Asia. The US and Germany are still the main destination of illegal trade. And also, CITES argues that there are multiple drivers and enablers, and one of the most important being is habitat loss and degradation driven by the expansion of agriculture, cattle ranching, and human infrastructures, that is, urbanization processes. So the following cartography articulates the Jaguar Corridor with these recent versions of a series of open and mostly georeferenced data concerning the anthropogenic transformations and socio-environmental struggles. This is the chart. And this cartography can be seen as a lens for spatial researchers and designers to explore urban areas by reconnecting them to the larger ecosystems upon which they depend, and as a departure point to narrate the urban landscapes of the jaguar. I developed this cartography with the collaboration of GIS expert Jeanette Rodriguez. So in a stronghold of urbanization, I have correlated 3 global conditions for biodiversity and sustainable use that are also usually referred as the 3 Cs with the corridor. So the 3 Cs is a biodiversity conservation framework that defines 3 broad territorial conditions by evaluating land use drivers and human pressures. And they divide it in cities and farms, shared lands, and wild areas. By correlating the 3 Cs with the Jaguar Corridor Initiative, the corridor emerges as a stronghold of urbanization. The expansion of urbanization has meant the retraction of the jaguar habitat. The region has urbanized from its southern and northern extremes, that is Brazil, Argentina to the south, and to the north Mexico, Central America, and northern Colombia. In these areas, sites and farms and shared lands have come to occupy over 76% of the territory. So the Amazon is the largest remaining habitat for the jaguar. If by 1900 the Amazon encompassed just 44% of the jaguar historic range, in Pantheria's conservation strategy, the Amazon makes almost 80% of the corridor. So there are 2 distinct territories within the corridor: the Amazon, with over 46% of large wildlife areas and less than 4% of cities, and beyond the Amazon, with only 3% of large wildlife areas and over 23% of cities and farms. While most of jaguar populations live in the Amazon region, the initiative, however, seeks to foster ecologically distinct jaguar populations across its range. Areas outside of the Amazon tend to be more critical, having to contend with the fragmentation of their habitat. It is in the southern and northern extremes where the territory has been mostly urbanized, and therefore where most preoccupation corridors are located. And preoccupation corridors are mainly landscape collectivity areas that are less than 10 kilometers, and because of this pose higher risks of fragmentation. So yet, even if the Jaguar Corridor is a stronghold of urbanization, many cities also overlap with these landscapes and need to recognize the corridor both in terms of public policy and in its municipal plans. Approximately 4 million people live within the corridor in 26 cities and towns with populations up to 1 million inhabitants, and approximately 87 million people live within just 60 kilometers from the corridor in 213 settlements. So this is a general scheme in which basically goes from south to north, and in altitude, as the Jaguar Corridor mainly lives below 2,000 meters. But even though many cities such as Bogota, which is over 10 million people, or Quito are above, they are less than 60 kilometers away from the corridor. And as said, there are many different types of cities, from oil industries, cities such as Barranca Bermeja, tourist cities, and small indigenous settlements. Almost half of these cities are located within the Amazon region, together forming a population of over 10.5 million cities. And these are the cities that actually overlap with the corridor. The most densely populated area of the corridor is its southern extreme, where the Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro metropolitan areas, that are also referred usually as the Brazilian megalopolis, surround Brazil remaining Atlantic tropical forest, the Mata Atlântica, which is a Jaguar Corridor unit of the highest priority with a decreasing and isolated jaguar populations. The corridor is also a contested territory. It is a frontier of extraction and waste disposal for the industrial economy. Dams, roads, agro-industrial plantations, mining sites, oil camps, and waste disposal sites, among other infrastructures, are in friction with the corridor. The correlation of the corridor with the inventory of the Environmental Justice Atlas, which collects ecological distribution conflicts from activists and researchers, enriches our understanding of the frictions at stake in these territories. In contrast to the more traditional maps that locate strategic resources, and in doing so privilege a view of the environment in terms of economic potential, environmental economist and co-founder of this initiative, Joan Martinez Alier, underscores that the EJA seeks to restore the antagonistic dimension of resource control and management by pointing both to the consequences resulting from its exploitation and the resistance against the consequences. So the fact that 30% of the cases in the hemisphere are in friction with the Jaguar Corridor is significant if we consider that the corridor only accounts for 8% of the total area of the Americas. As conflicts might remain undocumented, this does not necessarily mean that there is a higher number of conflicts, but it is certainly an indication of the strong mobilization occurring in these territories, even though in terms of resolution are reported to have succeeded. By 2020, there were 107 cases of socio-environmental conflicts directly overlapping with the Jaguar Corridor, while 275 were located within a 50 kilometers radius from it. 3 countries account for over half of the total documented struggles: Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador. Over half of the cases occur in the Amazon, mostly in Brazil. So here is how the cartography would link, like the interactive cartography, would link with the detailed research developed by the IJA. So each time you click, they have the whole history and reportage and bibliography of each of these cases. Seen through the lens of the 3 Cs, 65% of conflicts occur over shared lands, 28 in cities and farms, and 9.4 in wild areas, reflecting the expansive reach of urbanization. So the IJA traces socio-environmental conflicts between the 1950s up to the present. Over 60% of the cases overlapping with the corridor emerged between 2002 and 2013. And this peak, again, is related to the commodity boom that I talked about in the introduction and the emergence of IRSA. During this decade, Latin American countries increased their dependence on natural resource incentive exports due to the demand from China, which represented over 90% of the sales. A third of the cases within the corridor are related to the extraction of mineral ores and building materials such as gold, copper, diamonds, iron ore, silver, charcoal, gravel, and sand. And a fourth are related with biomass and land conflicts linked predominantly to the production of timber, oil palm plantations, and other monocrops, as well as cattle enterprises. The struggles over fossil fuels, mostly related to the extraction of crude oil and natural gas, and struggles over water management, mostly related to the construction of hydroelectric dams, account for 15%. The top contested commodities at stake in the Jaguar Corridor are land, gold, crude oil, water, timber, and electricity. Over a third of the Jaguar Corridor is recognized as indigenous territory, and accordingly, indigenous groups are the most frequent actors mobilizing against land dispossession and the extraction and exploitation of natures. Indigenous groups mobilize in over 20% of these cases. Yet, as Martinez earlier has underscored, there is intersectionality in the socio-environmental struggles documented. He explains that more than one group is often reported mobilizing in the same project and not necessarily for the same reason. However, what the IJA shows, following Martinez, is the disproportionate negative environmental effects of economic activities in terms of human health, livelihoods, and well-being on minority populations, or rather on the excluded majorities, as the Colombian environmental activist, social leader, and current Vice President Francia Marquez has rectified. Besides numerous indigenous groups in the cases in friction with the corridor, among the actors mobilizing are also Afro-descendant communities, ethnically, racially discriminated groups, landless peasants, fisher people, river people, women, waste speakers, informal workers, artisanal miners, and local and international environmental justice organizations, among others. On the other hand, the actors behind these environmental injustices involve most often companies, but also governments and government departments. Over 100 companies from various countries participate in the conflicts at stake in the Jaguar Corridor. The countries with the highest number of companies involved are Brazil, the United States, and Canada. Some of these companies are involved in more than one case, such as Petrobras, Vale, and Odebrecht in the case of Brazil, and Chiquita Brands, Chevron, and Allied Energy Systems Corporation in the case of the US. So by moving from an abstract idea of our interdependencies to the identification of concrete and material frictions and the precise actors involved, the Jaguar Corridor emerges as a contested socio-ecological ground where indigenous communities, peasants, and other marginalized populations across the region have struggled and even died for environmental justice. And this is by no means an exaggeration. Latin America is the world's riskiest place to be an environmental activist. According to Global Witness, in 2020, over 2/3 of the world murders of activists occurred in this region, with Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil being the most dangerous countries. Over a third of deaths are linked to resource exploitation, such as logging, mining, large-scale agribusiness, and hydroelectric dams, and other infrastructure. Although the report suggests that the number might be actually higher, as attacks tend to be unreported and are often not further investigated. Paradoxically, the main source of wealth of Pantera's founder and main donor, Thomas Kaplan, comes from mineral trading in precious metals such as gold and silver, including in Latin America, precisely the category with the highest number of conflicts within the corridor. Rather than an exception, often, as Ursula K. Hayes notes, individual organizations and corporations whose practices contribute to habitat destruction and species extinction both care and invest significant amounts of money in conservation efforts. Yet, the altruistic funding of businesses and corporations for conservation efforts cannot be separated from the ecological impoverishment and violence this enterprise can also produce, actually. So in the last section of the cartography, I developed a heat map that characterizes the corridor in terms of its frictions, for both the survival of the jaguar and the communities living in these areas. And to do so, I have identified the areas where issues related to the presence of the 3 Cs and farms, tree cover loss, and socio-environmental struggles overlap. In doing so, the map provides an integrated database of the urban landscapes of the corridor and identifies the areas according to their pressure. So level 4 is the one who has the most pressure. Critical areas follow the expansion of urbanization. Most areas are outside of the Amazon, particularly on the northern and southern extremes, but also in Colombia's Andean mountain range and its border with Panama, the critical bottleneck that would split the Trans-American corridor. Yet the Amazon, where jaguar life still thrives, and this is an additional of what you can also start to zoom in much more, has become increasingly critical, particularly in Brazil and Bolivia, in the form of deforestation for natural products and itinerant agriculture. The cartography also reveals that over 60% of critical areas are already protected, either as national parks, natural reserves, indigenous or Afro-descendant territories, or designated as biodiversity hotspots, which evidences that protection labels are far from sufficient to ensure the maintenance of the corridor. So this would be ideally like how the open platform would work, in which once you point to one side, it shows the correlation of the different information. So here's, in the case Colombia, Northern Andes bottleneck, there's a national park, Paramillo, there's a Jaguar Corridor unit, there's deforestation, there is some environmental justice struggles, and here just to point out, you know, like how rather than a pristine or green territory, this is actually a deeply social environment. So, for instance, Chiquita Brands has been linked to paramilitary groups. Cerro Matoso is the largest open mine that extracts iron and nickel, and has been shown that that the struggles led to violence, that there's air pollution, biodiversity loss, like you name it. So this cartography that I just showed, I consider it as a departure point to further narrate and discuss the urban landscapes of the Jaguar Corridor. And this is a process that I began to explore in a seminar with architecture students in Bogota in 2020 at La Universidad de los Andes. And during this seminar, what students did was to follow a piece of infrastructure that was overlapping with the corridor. And this cartography was not done at the time, but we were able to identify like the general ones in any case. So for instance, A group explored how tourism infrastructure in Mexico's Maya forest, like El Ferrocarril Maya, I think it's the name, compete with the largest habitat of the jaguar in Central America. Other group inquired on the connection between urbanization of the Mexico-US border and the construction of the wall and the retraction of the jaguar territory. Others inquired how the construction of Colombia's largest hydroelectric dam, Hidroituango, deflected the movement of the jaguar and displaced and disappeared local communities. Others discussed how the construction of one of IRSA's multimodal corridors to connect the Atlantic Ocean, that is Brazil, with the Pacific Ocean through the Amazon overlapped with the corridor. A group of students also approached the Amazon River both as a main piece of extractive infrastructure for urban Amazon and as the most important limit for the migration of the jaguar. So in this diagram, for instance, they were showing like the extraction of the different types of natures that were being extracted, such as gold, iron, uranium, wood, and here are like the commodities in which they become that are produced through these materials, right? Just showing how these natures are linked to urban life. So each of these reportages delved into one of the myriads of infrastructures in friction with the corridor. In narrating and visualizing these stories of entanglement, the city then is only part of the extended geographies of the urban, and the Jaguar Corridor Initiative is not an exclusive issue of wildlife conservation, but a contested ground where various communities struggle against the conversion of their lands into commodity extraction frontiers. So building upon the recognition of this entanglement, I propose to reinterpret the Jaguar as an infrastructure of care that can move us to recalibrate the urban landscapes of the corridor. So Panthera's initiative is making room for wildlife by weaving alliances at different scales, from aligning with the UN Sustainable Development Goals to pushing governments to include the project into public policies and programs with the Jaguar. The organization has teamed up with public works entities to design passages for jaguars within road infrastructures. It has encouraged cattle ranchers and African palm oil plantations to reserve green spaces and protect riparian environments for jaguars to cross private properties. Panthera has also developed long-term education and training programs for local communities to foster the understanding of the species and its potential value for ecotourism. The organization has also partnered with ISA, a natural gas corporation, towards the implementation of carbon credits in forest recovery and preservation programs. And seeking to reach an international audience, just last month an art installation of jaguars occupied various public spaces in New York City as part of the new founding campaign. Reinterpreting the corridor as an infrastructure of care means that far from a series of green patches to be left alone as untouched natures, these landscapes are more a contingent conjunction of ongoing scientific practices, institutional actors, legal agreements, government policies, business alliances, and local communities that depend on constant human attention, repair, capital, and labor. So this echoes Bruno Latour's stance that the environment is not what lies beyond and should be left alone, but what should be even more managed, taken up, cared for, stewarded. Yet, this caring is not merely a technical or expert affair. Rather, the corridor is a deeply political ground where different actors are contesting visions of nature, sustainability, economic development, and urban life. Defining what is to be attended, Lisa Slater underscores care is a world-making practice. Defining what is to be attended reflects what is valued or undermined in a society, and it is therefore a political decision. Seeing the corridor as an infrastructure of care entails reconnecting the urban experience to the troubled and often violent flows of extraction, as well as embracing alternative practices of cultivation and caring already present and enacted by the people living in these areas. Care, as well as cuidado in Spanish, has a double meaning that is interesting to recognize. Care means both sorrow, grief, and trouble, as well as serious mental attention. Cuidado is both a warning or a call to fear what can come and a commitment to be attentive with the perfection required. In Spanish, el cuidado, the one who is cared for, is also the one who is loved. Caring then is being embedded in the tension of love, an attentive cultivation, and a recognition that one's love can fail. Embracing this tension is part of conceiving the corridor as an infrastructure of care. To achieve this, the corridor might benefit from other forms of counter-mapping that render visible both the caring practices and struggles occurring in these territories. This search might be akin to the activities of the architects and artists of the Valparaiso School of Architecture, who during the 1970s, in response to government's impulses to conquest the Amazon, embarked on a series of introspective expeditions and called to recognize the continent no longer from its border, but from its vast interior sea, the Amazon. In the poetic act of rotating the map 180 degrees and selecting the Bolivian city of Santa Cruz as the continent's reference point, the group launched the idea of a Merida, a continent conceived from within. Perhaps a first step is to move towards an understanding of sustainability different from those precepts based on tipping points, which suggest limiting development up until ecological degradation compromises the needs of future generations. Caring is more aligned to the concept of promoting life discussed in the Manifesto for Abundant Futures. The manifesto explains that for the Anishinaabe society, the question of sustainability is not how much we can act before impairing the environment, but how much you can give up and what you can do to promote life. Caring for the corridor has, then, as much to do with nurturing the life of Jaguars, whose presence reveals a plurality of other lives, as with promoting the diverse ways of living of the communities that struggle for their right to live without being dispossessed or polluted by the demands of urban life. And that's the presentation. Thank you.